Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center on the road. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, and we are so grateful to Doug DeVos for being such a visionary cheerleader for our crucially important nonpartisan mission. Friends, in these polarized times, it's so important that there be an institution that brings together citizens of all perspectives, respectfully to explore areas of agreement and disagreement about the greatest document of human freedom in history, the US Constitution. And the debate that you're about to see is an example of what we call our traveling town hall program. We're traveling across the country, convening the greatest thinkers on all sides of the constitutional debates at the center of American life so that you, the people, can hear those arguments and then make up your own minds. And in that spirit, we're going to ask you today to take 2 very important votes. I'm going to ask you to vote in a moment on the question, should the Electoral College be abolished? Then you'll hear the debate on both sides, and then you'll vote again. And you'll decide whether your minds have been changed by any of the arguments that you've heard, and also whether your minds have been opened to the arguments on the other side. In casting your vote and in listening to this debate, I want you to do something that we ask everyone to do at the National Constitution Center, whether in a debate, in a conversation among students, or in a convening of learners of all ages, and that's to separate your political from your constitutional views. That may sound like an unfamiliar thing to do, but I am a law professor. I teach constitutional law, and I am an evangelist for the importance of asking, not in this case what you think the government should do, but what the Constitution allows or forbids it from doing. So if we were talking about the First Amendment, the question wouldn't be, is banning hate speech a good idea, but does the First Amendment allow or forbid you to ban hate speech? And in finding that sometimes your constitutional and your political conclusions diverge, you can elevate yourself above whatever your political preferences are and decide what you think the Constitution means. So today the debate is really important. Thanks to Lorna's incredible foresight, to her astonishing timing, and to her careful invitation of the candidates to come tomorrow, we're debating one of the most fundamental questions of the American Constitution. Should the Electoral College be abolished? Do you believe this is what the framers had in mind, and do you believe that the college serves the purposes for which it was established and serves important purposes today? So I don't want you to vote based on whether you think abolishing the Electoral College would help or hurt the candidate that you favor in this election, but instead what you think the Constitution requires. It's a very important task, so think very carefully before casting your vote, which I'm going to ask you to do right now. And the question is, should the Electoral College be abolished? Everyone who believes that on constitutional grounds, in terms of what's best for the American Constitution, the Electoral College should be abolished, please raise your hand. And everyone who thinks that the Electoral College should not be abolished, please raise your hand. Okay, we have a strong majority in favor of keeping the Electoral College, more than 2/3 to 1/3. Listen to the debate and listen with an open mind and see whether or not your opinion is changed. And now it is my great pleasure to turn the mic over to my colleague, friend, the great and visionary vice chair of the National Constitution Center, Hank Meyer.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome everyone. And I'm one of those people with changeable minds. I'm not sure where my arm would have gone up, so I'm really looking forward to hearing these gentlemen and their thoughts. But I guess I'd like to start out with Professor Caesar. When the founders conceived of the Electoral College, what were they trying to achieve?
Well, there were a lot of things involved, but I would begin by saying this. It's a misconception to think there are only 3 national institutions in the United States. Read the Constitution and you'll see there are 4. The system of presidential selection is widely discussed in the Constitution and integral to what the founders wanted. They had a vision for what was important in the selection of the president, and they weren't about to just leave it to go up and down anyway. They tried to institutionalize it. The second point I make, and this is an important one, is the Electoral College was supposed to control the selection of the president from the beginning to the end. That is to say, there were no nomination conventions by political parties. They didn't envision any political parties. The Electoral College was supposed to nominate or winnow and elect at the same time, or else turn it over to the House to elect. So the entire process from beginning to end was dictated by the Constitution of the United States. That was the intention of the founders. And I think that's a key point. The third point, maybe that should be made as well, is that this constitutional process from beginning to end was integral to the whole system of government. And their objective, I believe, was to preclude or make much less likely the selection of a dangerous popular leader. You could call it a demagogue or something like that. Everything was bent towards that end, to make sure that the president would be a pretty worthy character, but certainly not a dangerous one. They had looked back at ancient Greece, and they saw that republics were destroyed by the elevation of dangerous leaders. So if you look at maybe a little bit of what they intended, you see there was going to be no campaign as we know it today for the presidency. In fact, we really didn't have popular campaigns until the 20th century. Most of the times, those running for president stayed pretty quiet. They might maneuver in the background, but they didn't go out and campaign. So the effort was to avoid a campaign, to make the election fairly popular, given the circumstances at the time, but based upon the reputation of the candidates for their service to the country. And add, finally, they saw the selection system as a way to channel the ambition of those who wanted to become president, to channel it away from dangerous popular appeals and channel it towards making a record from themselves upon which the people would make their decision. Unfortunately, this is the end of the story, this system never really got going. It's been changed from the beginning, but it's interesting to think about what they had in mind, because I still think it gives us a lot of perspective on what we want to do for the presidential selection system today.
Jesse, just curious on your thoughts of, I'm a founder, what am I thinking?
Thanks, Hank and Jeff, and thank you for having me here. I'm used to speaking to New York audiences, so I look forward to the challenge.
Welcome to Michigan.
Seeing all these hands go up gave me a little thrill. It's actually, and I would say that I agree with virtually everything that Professor Caesar has said about why the Electoral College was adopted. I think I just want to emphasize a few points, which is, as Professor Caesar said, this was the most fraught and complicated decision that the framers made in Philadelphia in 1787. They all said this at the time. They said, I think there were something like 21 different days on which they debated how do we pick a president. They weren't even sure at the start if the president would be one person or a panel of people. And they held, I think, 31 or 32 separate votes on different mechanisms. The things that mattered to them included keeping the selection away from Congress. So this was some of the framers thought Congress should pick the president. Other framers, including James Madison and James Wilson, said that would be a disaster. We're trying to build a system of separated powers, and if the president is selected by Congress, he will be dependent on Congress for his job. That's not a separation of powers. So keeping it away from Congress was a big element. There were other concerns too. I think, as Professor Caesar said, this fear of elevating an unfit leader, a demagogue, a designing man, as the framers put it. And I think the concern there was largely over, not that people were ignorant or stupid, but that they actually just couldn't know enough about national political candidates. They knew their local leaders, right? But there was no communications or transportation network to speak of in 1787. And so their concern was really, what are we going to do when there are national leaders whose who may be known to us, the elites in Philadelphia, but who are not known to the vast majority of the voting public. And that's one more point I would just make, obviously, is when we talk about the people in 1787 comprised a very different percentage of the population than today, right? Slaves, virtually no black people could vote. Native Americans couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, poor white people couldn't vote. So the actual voting populace was a tiny sliver of the people who lived in the country. That's not the case today, and I think that's an important distinction when we talk about how are we choosing our national leader.
And moving on to more delicate terrain, I suppose, we've talked about the conception of the Electoral College. Only a handful of times in our almost 250-year history has the popular vote and the electoral vote diverged, but it has been happening with greater frequency in more recent decades. What would the founders think of the Electoral College today? Jim?
They wouldn't recognize that much about it, to be frank. It's evolved in its own way. A lot of people say it's archaic. It's not archaic because the way it's evolved over the years is pointed in a very different direction. This is the one point where we don't have the original, and I can add too that the Electoral College is not really a college. You can't get a degree from it or any such thing. So I think it sort of has to be judged on its own terms as it's evolved. And I would say, on balance, my feeling, and this is just a guess, that they would find much in this system that they would be attached to. I know this could be argued both ways, but much in this system they could attach to. I think it's the primary defender in the United States, or one of the primary defenders of federalism. That our whole federal structure, when you begin to think about it, rests to a large extent upon the Electoral College. And if you do away with the Electoral College, as it's functioning today, you're going to have great difficulties for federalism. And I doubt you'd be having tomorrow a vote for delegates in Michigan. What would Michigan count if we were all selected, say, by a national majority? You'd have some other system. And all sorts of other things, which a little bit later on I'd like to be able to develop to show how you'd be pressured, inevitably, to give up all federal control of elections by the states. For example, should felons vote? Well, in one state they do, in one state they don't. Am I going to allow my view on felons from the state of Virginia to hold sway? Or do I have to agree to what is being done in another state? If you're thinking of a national election where every vote counts the same, you're thinking about giving every person voting for the United States the same possibility to register to vote, and the registration is different from state to state. The same mechanisms for voting by mail in Oregon, you have to show up at a precinct in Virginia, by when your gubernatorial elections are chosen, because that brings more people in. We do it in the off-off year in Virginia. Others do it in the presidential year. Go through every structure that you can think of in the electoral sphere, and you'll see that there would be immense pressure to make this all the same. 178,000 voting districts in the United States, in the end, controlled by a TSA of the US government trying to count the votes and keep it straight. I don't think that's the direction we want to go in.
So Jesse, you're a founder, move forward.
I mean, just to respond to that point, I would say making it easier for more people to vote is a good thing in my mind. In a modern democracy, I would support all sorts of measures that would expand the electorate, bring more people in, involve more people in our democracy. I think a democracy functions better when more people participate in it. I want to also just, though, respond to the point about federalism. I think just let's get our definitions clear here. Federalism is a term that refers to the allocation of power between the federal government and state governments. It is a central part of our American Republic. It was put there by the framers. I think it's a brilliant design in so many ways. And I think federalism is very well protected in the system we have right now. We have, obviously, I think the most obvious protection of it is the Senate, in which All the states have an equal vote, no matter how many citizens they have. And that gives states power disproportionate to their population in a way that I think checks a lot of perhaps what you might see in the federal government. You have state governments, you have a governor, you have state lawmakers, you have your representatives in Congress. These are all elements of our structure of federalism. There is one job in America where the requirement is representing all people equally. That's the President of the United States. My argument in my book, Let the People Pick the President, no spoilers here, is that for that position, everyone should have an equal say, everyone's vote should matter equally, and the person who is elected should be the person who got the most votes in the entire country, because the entire country is the jurisdiction over which the president exercises authority. That doesn't mean that federalism isn't still fully operational, that we don't still have a Senate that can check a president who wants to do something, that we still don't have a House of Representatives that can do that we still don't have state governments that are making their own laws for their own states. It only means that in electing the one office that is responsible for the entire country as a whole, we elect the person to that office as a whole.
Thank you.
Many thanks for that. Thanks for jumping right into the substantive arguments for and against the abolition of the Electoral College. And let's dig into some of them now. Professor Caesar, you mentioned the end of federalism, and sometimes that objection takes a more specific form. And one of the strong cases for keeping the Electoral College is that it forces candidates to campaign and win support from all over the country. And if it were eliminated, then big cities would dominate in a national popular vote system. Maybe make that case with some more detail.
Well, how it would operate, I think, is going to vary from, to a large extent, from election to election. And you'd never know, like, that Michigan would be the most important state in 2016 and the most important state tomorrow. Good for Michigan, but I don't think that's going to happen forever. It's going to change from condition to condition. But overall, I think, if you look at it, Americans are used to thinking of a large part of their political life in terms of their states and organizing things in terms of their states. For example, who's governor? What's the state party like? All sorts of elements which point to the state. And what do the candidates do when they campaign for president today? They also are forced to think in terms of states. What states can I win, is what they ask. They really don't care about the Electoral College, about the popular vote. It's a misnomer to say that if you lose the vote, that you would have lost it anyhow. No, it's a different game, and you would play by different rules. People look, or they should look, at who's going to win the Electoral College. Maybe Mrs. Clinton forgot that in 2016, but she's been reminded of it ever since. She could show up at a couple of places that are important. So that's what they focus on. They reinforce that character. I would say generally, you mentioned big cities, under this system of a national popular vote of some sort or other, people are going to look where they can get the most bang for their buck in the shortest amount of time, and that's going to be where people are in a concentrated area. I won't say that completely. You know, people are interested in the vote simply, but you're not about to waste a lot of time on running around Wyoming for 300,000 votes when you can hit the same people on television that night every time in Los Angeles or New York.
Jesse Wegman, in your book, you reject both of the arguments that Professor Caesar just defended. Namely, you disagree that the Electoral College forces candidates to campaign and win support from all over the country, and you disagree that big citizens would dominate in a national popular vote. Tell the audience why.
Sure. The two are, I think, linked in important ways. First, I think it's important for us to understand how the Electoral College actually functions, because I think that's something that a lot of us don't know. There are millions of Americans who think the president is elected by a popular vote right now. I think that percentage went down after 2016, but it's remarkable how many people assume that majority rule and direct vote is how we do it. So just to the first point, which is about campaigning everywhere. What's important to understand is that the Electoral College gives every state, the Constitution gives every state a number of electors who cast their electoral votes, equal to their representation in Congress, which means the number of members of the House of Representatives and 2 senators. Beyond that, states have virtually unlimited authority to do what they want with those electors. They can allocate those electors in whatever way they choose. They can do it by the state legislature. The state legislature can do it themselves. I mean, I don't know how many people here know, you have no right to vote. You have no constitutional right to vote for president at all. You don't even have a constitutional right to vote for your electors. That right is given to you by your state legislature. At the beginning of the country, when the states first started operationalizing the Electoral College, many of them awarded their electors by the state legislature. The voters of the state had no role at all. And this went up into the early 1800s. Slowly, they switched over to what we now know is the standard, which is a popular vote for electors in your state. So actually, we do have a popular vote, it's just divided by states. The second part of this is, whom do you give your electors to? You can divide it up however you want. You could look at what the weather in Cuba is today and say, we're going to decide based on that. I mean, it could be anything. And what 48 out of 50 states do is they give all of their electors to the candidate who wins the most votes in that state. They can win by a single vote, they can win by 100 votes, they can win by 10,000 votes, as Donald Trump did, I think, in Michigan in 2016. They can win by 1 million votes. It doesn't matter. They get all of the electoral votes in that state. That's called winner take all. And winner take all, I think, is the central defining principle of our modern electoral college, and it is why candidates do not campaign in the entire country. They, in fact, focus virtually all of their time and all of their money and all of their attention on about anywhere from 5 to 10 battleground states every year. By the time of the summer, when we hit the conventions, that's reduced to maybe 3 or 4 battleground states. We can all name them. We're in one right now. And as Professor Caesar said, they do shift over time. Different states were once battleground states, no longer are, and vice versa. But the bottom line is, whichever the states are, there are very few of them right now. 40 plus states have virtually no relevance to the presidential campaigns. So in fact, when you look at where presidents aim their attention and aim their money, aim their advertising, it is at, I think, something like 94% of all of their money and time went to 10 states in 2016. That, to me, is a pretty significant distortion of the popular, of a representation of the popular will. If 140 or so million Americans are voting, and yet fewer than 1 in 5 of them are actually being spoken to and cared about by the presidential campaigns, I think that causes a lot of harm to the idea of representative democracy, which is, in theory, the system that we live under, a republic. And so that, I think, that answers that question, which is, well, doesn't the Electoral College force candidates to campaign everywhere and to pay attention to everywhere? In fact, it doesn't. The issue about big cities, I think Professor Caesar is right that, campaigns are rational actors, right? They have limited time, they have limited money. They're going to spend it in the most effective way possible. Some of that would mean going to bigger cities where you can get more votes. But I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding about how presidents actually generate interest in voting. They don't, presidents don't, going to somewhere like Wyoming to get their 500,000 votes versus somewhere like Los Angeles with their many millions of votes, it's not such an easy calculus where you say one matters and the other one doesn't. Take, for example, the way governors run for office. Governors are basically like mini presidencies, right? They are like mini popular vote presidencies because in every state in the country, 50 states, the governor needs to win the most votes. The person who becomes governor has to win the most votes, and all the votes in that state count the same. That states don't have electoral colleges, right? Which is another point, by the way. I think if the Electoral College were this brilliant invention, I think states would have adopted it by now. But you have a system in which governors have to win the most votes in the state, and all of those votes count equally. So when you look at how governors run for election, you learn a lot about how a national popular vote would run. governors and gubernatorial candidates, and you ask any of them, will say, of course, you go everywhere. You cover the whole state because you need votes from everywhere. Even if you're going to lose a county or lose a region, you just want to lose it by less. You don't want, you know you're not going to win the majority there, but you want to lose by less because every vote counts. So you look, and it's quite remarkable. You look in Ohio, you look in Virginia, you look in Iowa, all of it is the same. They go to where They visit the state in proportion to where people live. Now, in my mind, that's a great way to run an election, which is you get votes from everywhere, and you visit and pay attention to places in relation to how many people live there.
Thanks so much for that. Professor Caesar, you just heard Jesse Wegman say, instead of enforcing candidates to campaign in every state, the Electoral College focuses the campaign first in 12 states and then in the general in 3 states. So it focuses the campaign in Michigan, but it doesn't tend to the interests of the rest of the country. Maybe respond to that point and also to the further point in favor of the Electoral College that it protects smaller and more rural states as opposed to larger and more urban states.
Well, let me begin with the second one. It's true numerically the smaller states get an advantage because they get their number of people that come from the House of Representatives, like 1, and then they get 2 by virtue of being a state, which they otherwise wouldn't deserve. In fact, Wyoming would probably deserve nothing. It'd be a little county of California or something like that. However, in truth, when you look at it, since it's winner take all, these smaller states don't count very much, and people go and look towards the bigger states or the ones that happen to be more important. So it helps a little bit, but it's not that significant. On the other point, yeah, it is true that the focus of the presidential election campaign varies from year to year, and it doesn't include all 50 states. You know who's going to win California. It's going to be the Democrats by a few million votes, and if they ever learn how to count their ballots in California, by the way, they're still counting their ballots from the Super Tuesday. And in presidential elections, we don't know how California votes until 4 or 5 weeks afterwards. But you know it's going to go for a Democrat. You know other states are going to go for a Republican. Maybe it would shift if candidates debated in those states, but it's going to focus on some main states. I think every so often, not in every time, there's some advantage to that. I think 2016 really, in some ways you could say it's deplorable because it would have been nicer if the president who won the Electoral College also won the popular vote. I agree with that. That's better. But that's not the only consideration. It turns out in 2016, a series of very important questions and issues were raised by where those states were being decided, namely all this area in the Midwest. That was sort of a focus on what do the American people or a group of the American people, say the forgotten persons in American people, what they were thinking about. And the intense effort of people to focus on that raised issues which I think otherwise would have gotten lost. I don't say this is going to happen every time, but I think everyone knows that in 2016 this really was the issue. What about, say, the deplorables? How are they going to vote? Does it matter? Is the election being driven one way or not? It posed some very essential questions for Americans, which I think otherwise would have been forgotten.
Thanks for that. Jesse Wegman, Professor Caesar just said, well, maybe the Electoral College doesn't always protect smaller states, but it did in the last election protect rural states and their interests. Respond to why you think that argument is wrong, and you also don't think the Electoral College protects smaller states either.
Professor Caesar's right. This idea, I think it's a very common defense of the college that you see, say, on social media or in the public that the small states will never go for it. And it's just not true for the reasons Professor Caesar just laid out, which is winner take all is such a more powerful impact on state power than that extra 2 electors that the small states have. I will just point out, people say that all the time. The small states will never go for it. The small states will harm. I think we want to ask the small states themselves. And you find out that leaders of small states and politicians in small states have long understood that the Electoral College harms them in particular for this reason, that winner take all makes California count vastly more than, say, Wyoming or Michigan. Or Florida or North Carolina, these other swing states count vastly more. if that weren't the case, you wouldn't see, in fact, in 1966, a group of small states led by Delaware brought a federal lawsuit against New York and other large states, alleging that winner-take-all was a violation of their rights to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. Because of this reason, because they said, you give all of your electors to the winner of your state, even if that person won, a bare majority or just a plurality and more than all the other candidates. That's no fair to us because we don't count now. This was a group of small states. I think in the end it was something like 13 small states or smaller states were signed on to this lawsuit. The Supreme Court never took the suit because winner take all is clearly allowed under the Constitution. But just to go to show that I think when you actually ask the small states, you find that there isn't that kind of, I think, misapprehension about whether they're protected. When you mention rural, I think it's a funny thing. People conflate rural and small often. I don't think that's quite right. If you want to use rural as a proportion of the state, I think Ohio is a more rural state than Rhode Island, for instance. There's rural means a lot of different things. There's huge rural swaths of California. If rural voters lean Republican, which I think they do, what about all of those voters? They disappear in the presidential election. They don't matter because California, as Professor Caesar said, is today a safe Democratic state. The same is true in New York. There are many rural voters in upstate New York. They might as well not exist because when New York actually votes for the president, which happens on December 18th or 19th, not on November 3rd, when the electors go and cast their ballots, they will cast all of them, all 29 of New York's electoral votes for the Democratic candidate. Anyone who voted for a Republican in New York is essentially wiped off the map before the voting happens. So I think rural voters right now are essentially ignored. Small state voters are essentially ignored. And I don't understand the argument for why, and this gets back to something Professor Caesar said earlier, was people think in terms of states. I would push back on that a little. I don't think anyone has ever voted for president based on what state he or she lived in. I don't think people vote based on the size of their state. I don't think people vote based on where their state is. I think people vote based on which party they feel better represents their views of the world. I think Rhode Island has more in common with California than it has with Wyoming. So this idea that states have some sort of political identity, which gets drummed into our heads by seeing those big red-blue maps every 4 years, those maps are just they're a fiction. They're the visual representation of the winner-take-all rule, right? In blue states like California, as Professor Caesar said, there are millions and millions of Republicans. In Texas, there are millions and millions of Democrats, but we don't represent it that way. We represent it as red or blue, and I think that's very harmful to a representative democracy.
Thanks for that. Professor Caesar, I began by asking the audience to separate their political from their constitutional views. But in this debate, there's a widespread perception that the Electoral College helps Republicans and hurts Democrats. For most of American history, that wasn't true, and Jesse Wegman tells a story about how a constitutional amendment nearly passed in the early 1970s, proposed by a Democratic senator and supported by Gerald Ford, President George H.W. Bush, and Richard Nixon. So it's only recently that this has become a partisan question. Does the Electoral College help one party or the other? And can you give the audience a nonpartisan reason for supporting the Electoral College separate from political preferences?
I think I've been nonpartisan all along. But it's going to change over time, probably, in who it helps or hurts. For example, in the famous 2000 election, go back and look at the newspapers, probably even the New York Times, 2 weeks before the election. And what was the strategy? Was Al Gore trying to figure out how he was going to win by getting fewer votes but winning the Electoral College. And he expected that till the very end. What happened was a surprise. I also think in 2004, when John Kerry was fighting to take hold of Ohio, which he thought there were some shenanigans there, that would have given him the election with less votes than George Bush. So it seems from the last election of 2016 that it's helping Republicans now. It seems that way. Even there, I'm not sure. I think Trump probably would have lost in any case, given what happened in California. But the main part of his strategy was to go for the electoral votes and not the popular votes. So I'm not absolutely sure that he couldn't have won the popular votes. I think probably the case. I wouldn't make a prediction in the long term on a partisan basis. I'll tell you this, I favored the Electoral College, recognizing some of its problems for a long time. And the country's changed. I can't say I've changed, but the country's changed, and I think that's how it will continue to be. We haven't mentioned, and maybe we should at some point, cheating, which is a really important point. Maybe we can get to that as well.
We absolutely can, and you can take it up, Jesse, but first, why don't you tell this riveting story of how this confluence of bipartisan giants, including Presidents Ford and Richard Nixon, converged. Tell the story of Birch Bayh and how he almost got a constitutional amendment passed, and then tell our great multi-partisan audience for why it's wrong to assume that the college will always help one party or another, and why they should abolish it regardless of their party.
Yeah, I will agree with everything that Professor Caesar just said on that point, and I'll get to it in a minute. Just to give you a very quick sketch of what happened in the mid-1960s up until 1970, and if you want to learn more, you can read about it in my book, which is coming out next week, if the supply chains aren't interrupted. So in 1965, 1964, America passed, the Congress passes and President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, followed closely by the Voting Rights Act. And then at the same time, just right before that, we have a series of decisions in the US Supreme Court, which you may know as the one-person, one-vote decisions. And these rulings fundamentally reshaped American representative democracy. Because what they did is they rejected maps that were drawn by politicians that were drawn in such a way as to intentionally disenfranchise large groups of people. It happened all over the country. Of course, it happened in the South, but it was happening everywhere. And those rulings very quickly required states to redraw their maps in such a way as to more closely approximate what we call today one person, one vote. The combination of those rulings and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which suddenly, I think, finally made real the promise of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which were 100 years old by that point, but that had never really been given any teeth by the federal government. Those two things together, I think, really changed the way Americans thought about who was a part of our democracy, what did equality mean, what did it mean to cast a vote for president? And Birch Bayh, who's this young senator from Indiana, coming up, he just entered the Senate in 1963, he takes on this task. Now, he was initially a skeptic of the popular vote. He was fine with the Electoral College. He thought, if anything, it maybe needed a little tweak here or there. The big concern in the mid-1960s was faithless electors, right? We all know this term today because the Supreme Court is about to hear a case on faithless electors. Faithless electors are those who vote for a candidate other than their party's nominee, right? There's never been more than a very small handful in any election. None of them have ever tipped an election one way or the other, but they exist. And there's always been the parties, the national parties are terrified of them because of this sort of the X factor that they present. So he gets involved in trying to get an amendment passed to the Constitution that will eliminate the possibility of faithless electors. I just want to say, by the way, and this gets back to Jeff's admonition at the very beginning about separating our politics from the larger, sort of our larger values and our constitutional structure. It wasn't until November 7th, 2000, election night 2000, that this became sort of what seems now to us to be inextricably a partisan issue. For all of American history, from the end of the 18th century until November 6th, 2000, the Electoral College was not a partisan issue. There have been more than 700 attempts in Congress to amend or abolish the college throughout our history. That is far more than for any other provision of the Constitution. And those challenges, those efforts came from the left, they came from the right, they came from the center. The point is, everybody understood from very early on the sort of central unfairness and imbalance of the way that the Electoral College came to function, which is through winner-take-all, these winner-take-all laws. So you had proposed amendments as early as 1816 trying to abolish the Electoral College. James Madison himself tried to get an amendment passed. James Madison lived longer than any other founder. He lived 50 years past the adoption of the Constitution. So he got to see their ideas play out in practice. And Madison himself in 1823 writes a letter to a friend saying, basically in current parlance, winner-take-all is a complete disaster. We have to end it. It destroys representative government. He proposed he proposed allocating electors by congressional district, which is what 2 states today do, Maine and Nebraska. But he wanted to abolish the practice of winner-take-all completely. He wanted to prohibit states from doing it at all. So you see this large trend throughout American history of efforts to amend or abolish the college that have no partisan sheen at all. When you get to the mid-1960s, Birch Bayh, after holding several months of hearings in Congress on the question of what do we do about the Electoral College, he has this complete about-face, and he gives this speech, this remarkable speech in 1966, where he says, I was wrong. The Electoral College needs to be abolished. It is damaging America in every election, and we have to end it. And it's actually a very eloquent speech, and he begins this movement to pass an amendment that would abolish the college in favor of popular vote. As Jeff says, this movement is signed on to by President Nixon in 1968, by Gerald Ford a few years later, by Bob Dole, by George H.W. Bush when he was in Congress. This was, to people of all parties and all ideological leanings, this felt like the sensible thing to do. It passed in 1969, it passes the House, an amendment to abolish the Electoral College passes the House overwhelmingly. I think 80% of the House voted in favor. And by the way, that's representatives from small states, from medium states, from big states. They were all voting in favor of abolishing the Electoral College. The Senate looks like they're very close to getting it, to doing the same, and then moving it on to the states for ratification, where roughly 36 states seem to be, from surveys, seem to be on board with adopting it. It's blocked by a filibuster in the Senate in 1970, led by 3 Southern senators who were all segregationists, Strom Thurmond, James Eastland, and Sam Ervin. They understood the functioning of the college to be to their benefit in the South, where for generations, obviously, black voters had virtually no voice. And I think they understood that changing to a popular vote was going to completely upend that system. So I think that was something that I think you can't deny the racial element of this in talking about how the Electoral College has functioned throughout history. But I will just make one small final point, sorry for going on about this. They were joined, interestingly, by black leaders, black political leaders in the northern states in places like New York and Illinois. People don't remember this today. New York was the biggest swing state in the country through the middle of the 20th century. And the voters who swung New York, one way or the other, to the Democrats or the Republicans, were largely racial and ethnic minorities in the cities. So black political leaders understood that the Electoral College gave them incredible leverage to help elect the president of the United States, outsized leverage, disproportionate leverage. And so those leaders joined with Strom Thurmond, an arch segregationist, to help protect the Electoral College at this moment of its greatest peril. As Jeff said, it was the closest we've ever come to abolishing the college, even though everyone forgets it today, and it was only 50 years ago. And I think that just goes to show that putting aside the partisan question, which it feels like today, the Electoral College's defenders have almost always, with President Company excluded, the Electoral College's defenders have almost always come to its defense based on a belief that it helps them and not on sort of higher principles.
Thank you very much for all that. We have time for one last round of comments and then a crucial final question from Hank Meyer before you cast your vote. So, Professor Caesar, give the audience your final case in favor of retaining the Electoral College. You talked about cheating and the dangers that might follow if it were abolished. There's also concern that it would be hard for candidates to get a majority of votes. Share all the best arguments that you still want to make about why we need to retain the Electoral College.
Well, first of all, when you look at this, be assured that there's no electoral system that's perfect. And there are problems with the Electoral College. That's not the issue. The question is whether there's more problems with the alternative. I haven't had a chance to see Jesse's book. It's under wraps. It's coming out next week. I'm sure you'll want to buy it. I'm not sure what plan he endorses in this, but so I can't make comments, but I've looked at the alternatives, and they have distinct problems, which I think are worse than the Electoral College system. The different alternatives. For example, one system, which you mentioned, 1960, was to have a system in which the plurality winner would become, vote winner would become the president unless that person, no person got more than 40% of the vote, somewhat like a Southern primary today. If no one got more than 40% of the vote, you have a runoff election. So that was the plan. But to think about that, a runoff election means that third-party candidates will get into the election to try and show their strength, push everyone below 40%, and then negotiate in the period before, throwing their votes one way or another. The consequence would be third and fourth parties. I don't think that's the direction we want to go. That's one of these examples where I say that you have to look at all the alternatives and lay them out. As for cheating, I'm very impressed with cheating in elections. I think it's somewhat minimized. I mean, we have the problems we've had in some of the states. But it's somewhat minimized by the fact that for most states, there's not that much percentage in trying to cheat because you're only controlling your state, and it's probably not going to control the election. There are exceptions to that, but that would be the case. If it's a national election, the imperative or the incentive to cheat goes up dramatically. And think of how this would work. Election night proceeding, people turn on the television. Oops, it's close. What's going to happen in places like California? As people say, by changing a certain number of the votes, we can change the outcome of the election. Who's there to stop this in many of these districts? Go look at the districts in these states, and you'll see while nominally they're supposed to have a Republican and Democrat, that's not the case at all. There's people can stuff ballots one way or another, and I fear cheating. In any case, the accusation of cheating, if you're within 1%, which is frequent, delays the entire outcome of the election, and we're spending I don't know how many weeks or months trying to determine what the actual vote was. An impossible task under current circumstances.
Thanks for that. Jesse, you do endorse an alternative in your new book, which I've been lucky enough to get an advance copy of, and it is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Tell us what that is and why you think it would be an effective alternative to the Electoral College that could be achieved without a constitutional amendment.
So I'll explain briefly what that is, and then I just want to follow up on a comment that Professor Caesar made. So my book's subtitle is The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College. So let the people pick the president, the case for abolishing the Electoral College. My publisher made me put that on there. We had a long discussion about this because the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact that Jeff just mentioned does not abolish the Electoral College. It actually uses the Electoral College as it is designed in the Constitution, which is to say it lets states decide for themselves how to allocate their electors. And what the compact does, states that join the compact, this is a contract, it's just an agreement among states. States do this all the time. They create compacts with one another for over water rights or multi-state lotteries, whatever it might be. What this compact does is states that join it agree to give all of their electors not to the candidate who wins the most votes in their state, but to the candidate who wins the most votes nationwide. When states representing a majority of electoral votes in the country, which is currently 270, join this compact, the compact takes effect, which guarantees that the person who wins the most votes in the country becomes the president and forces candidates to go everywhere for their votes because they need to get a higher vote count. I think it is one way to get to a popular vote. I think it's clever. I think it's elegant. It has Republican and Democratic backers who are going around the country trying to sell it to state lawmakers. They've passed it in 15 states right now, plus the District of Columbia, for a total of 196 electoral votes. Virginia is right on the cusp right now, so if Virginia passed it, it would be 209, which is 61 votes away from a majority. The one problem with it right now is that all the states that have joined it are led by Democrats. I don't think that's a great look for a transformation of our way of electing the president. I think it's a misunderstanding. When people get upset about that, I still think it's a misunderstanding of how the compact works, which is that it opens it up and lets everybody's vote count. It's not quieting certain votes and giving more power to other votes, but nevertheless, I think it would be best in terms of the optics for everybody to join into this. And in fact, before the 2016 election, 3 Republican-led states were on the edge of passing this compact. They didn't do it because of what happened in 2016. That was a big setback to this cause because people suddenly sort of jumped into their corners. But I just want to return for a moment to, again, Jeff's opening point and something Professor Caesar said earlier, which is this is really important, and to help anybody who's struggling to separate the politics from the principle, I think this can help. Professor Caesar is absolutely right. You change the rules, you change the outcome. We don't know how elections would play out if the goal were to win more votes than to win the Electoral College. Donald Trump insists that he would have won the popular vote too. And who am I to say he wouldn't, right? I tend to agree with Professor Caesar that he probably wouldn't have, but Donald Trump did very well in the states where he actually campaigned. He actually won those states. He won the popular vote in those states where he campaigned. He's a compelling campaigner. So I think we can't guess. And if you look at the elections, this is the other point. People think, oh, Democrats just want this because they win popular votes. In fact, they don't. If you go from 1932 until today, elections, popular vote, you have about 1.5 billion votes cast in all, popular votes cast, 1.5 billion. Do you know what the difference between the votes for the Democrats and the votes for the Republicans are over that time period, which is, what are we at now, 80 years? 700,000 votes. It's a population of Alaska, all right? In other words, the parties are essentially tied over the long run. When one party gets a little too popular in this area, or one party gets a little too popular, they make adjustments, they adapt, they change their strategy. I think to believe that the Electoral College or the popular vote systematically benefits either party is really a mistake, as Professor Caesar said. And I think what that gets to is we, as a people, really all in our hearts understand the appeal of majority rule in a modern constitutional democracy. I think this idea that somehow the Electoral College is the way to do it, look at, just as an example, Donald Trump on election night 2012, he tweets, "The Electoral College is a disaster for a democracy." That's Donald Trump saying that. The reason he said it is because it looked briefly as though Mitt Romney was going to win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College to Barack Obama. Just the hint that his candidate was going to win more votes and lose the election infuriated him, and I say, yeah, I understand the feeling, you know? It's really remarkable how I think instinctive that feeling is for all of us, and when it happens to you, how quickly your position changes on what the value of the Electoral College is. So I think in a modern democracy where everybody is enfranchised, with the exception of a few people with criminal convictions, I think in a modern constitutional democracy, I think it's very hard to make the case that majority rule shouldn't determine the outcome.
Thanks for that. We have one last crucial question from Hank Meyer to help you, voters in Michigan, make up your mind and cast your final vote.
Well, I guess as we wrap up, we've heard very convincingly that the Electoral College does not play partisan favorites. But I have to ask a question both as a selfish Michigander and as a member of the Economic Club. While Michigan happens to be the epicenter this year, and it was 4 years ago, and I realize, as Professor Caesar said, those tides shift, we could also argue that Michigan will be a purple state as far out in the future as most of us can see. And while we may get tired of the TV ads, there are millions of dollars pouring in. There are dozens of politicians coming in, wondering what Michigan is interested in, playing to us. It's very flattering and lucrative.
It's great. We want some of that.
So it's hard. It may be harder for us to give up the Electoral College because of
absolutely.
Sorry. Jim first, yeah.
I agree, and this time you'll probably get some Bloomberg money as well. We're talking high stakes. Yeah, I mean, Virginia was once an important state that was in the middle. I remember I used to get not a phone call, silence during the election period was bliss. Then it became a battleground state, and you couldn't get the phone out of the way. I had my phone taken out, and now it's back to a pretty safe Democratic state. I don't know which I like more, but they're going to change, and I agree that Michigan probably will remain a battleground. Your self-interest, though, should not be your determining factor. Let me make that clear.
I'd just say, you said Michigan is a purple state. All states are purple states. Every state has large numbers of voters that support both parties. California, millions of Republicans. Texas, millions of Democrats. Go down the line. I mean, that's the basic argument of my book, is that we are a purple country. And we are a battleground of a country, and the candidates who want to lead this country should have to treat us like that, rather than zeroing in on just a few, happenstance counties in a few battleground states.
Thank you so much for a wonderful and rich conversation. And now it is time for your crucially important vote. You realize the stakes could not be higher for the future of democracy. You've heard the arguments on both sides. You've carefully separated your political from your constitutional views. And I want you to vote again. And in voting on the question, should we abolish the Electoral College, you can interpret that to mean as it's currently operating. And if you want to adopt the National Compact of Popular Vote Initiative, then you should vote in favor of abolishing the Electoral College. And if you want to keep the system as it is, vote against abolishing the Electoral College. So with all that in mind, having heard the arguments, who would vote to abolish the Electoral College? And who would vote to retain the Electoral College? And who has changed his or her mind based on the arguments that you've heard? Wonderful. And whose mind has been opened to the arguments on the other side? Beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our debaters.
Thank you.
I picked up a few.